All right. Good morning, Communication Track Toastmasters. As a brief reminder, please be sure, unless Tony is looking for audience interaction, please be sure to keep yourselves on mute. We are looking to ensure for a simple audience, a quiet audience, and an interactive as needed. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker for Weaving a Tale, How to Storytell. Tony Dahlman, Distinguished Toastmaster, brings Toastmaster experience from Washington, D.C., serving as an area director within their district. We're very lucky to have his talents here in District 19, where he has served as an area director and a current division director for Division Y. Along with his talents for leadership, Tony is a fantastic storyteller, taking part in a number of events, both in Iowa as well as in the Minnesota area. Tony, a pleasure to have you here, and please help me welcome Distinguished Toastmaster, not only with certification, but also in his own right, Tony Dahlman. Tony.
Thank you very much, Matthew. It's a pleasure to be here today. It was about 6 years ago, I was in a car with my wife, and we were living in the Washington, D.C. area at the time, and we were driving up to a temple in Bethesda, Maryland. And we went up to this temple, and we weaved our way into the seated area that had a whole bunch of folding chairs and a large stage up in the front of the room. And there we were watching a storytelling show. It's a man that I knew from one of my Toastmasters areas in Washington, D.C., had been invited to take part in a storytelling show. And I have been into many Toastmasters contests in the past, so I'd seen many speeches. So this was something that was just a little bit different, something that I wasn't completely familiar with. So as I was watching the show, I started becoming completely captivated by all the stories that were being told. I still remember the story of a man who told a story of how one time when he was playing chess when he was a kid, and he was part of a big chess competition, and he was cheating in this game, and this allowed him to win the game. And it was still something that he was guilty with over decades later. And I immediately knew that I had uncovered something in speaking, that I had uncovered something that was just so much more powerful and was going to create some very interesting tools that I was going to be able to use in my speaking future, and that was storytelling. So as Matthew said, today we're going to learn about how to weave a tale in storytelling, and I'm going to attempt to give you some tips on how you can implement some storytelling tools in your speeches as well as any other communication that you do in your life. So as Matthew said, I've been involved in public speaking for pretty much my entire life. I started off as a public speaker in 4-H and FFA through growing up in central Minnesota. It's when I got out of college, I decided that I want to continue on becoming a better public speaker, so I joined my local Toastmasters club. I started off in South Dakota and eventually moved to Washington, D.C., where I was in Toastmasters in both areas. In Washington, D.C., I became involved in the local storytelling scene. One of the groups I was with was called Story District, where I participated in many of their shows, including a large Valentine's Day show that took place in a historic theater in Washington, D.C. to an audience of over 800 people. I've continued on storytelling when I moved to Iowa about 3 years ago, and have been involved in a few shows here in Iowa as well as Minnesota. So it's over the past few years, I've been attempting to help my storytelling skills in an attempt to make my storytelling skills better. And I'm hoping that I'm going to be able to share some of the tools and tricks that I've learned over the past few years today. First of all, where credit is due, I'm going to be incorporating a lot of ideas that I've learned from Matthew Dick's book, Storyworthy. And Matthew Dix is a storytelling teacher and coach in the Hartford, Connecticut area. And he has also won the Moth Storytelling Grand Slam competition several times. He's won over 35 Moth Slams, and this is the kind of book that I've been looking for a while, that it has given me more good tips in terms of how to pick up and how to become a better storyteller, how to come up with better storytelling ideas. So if you want to become a better storyteller, my first piece of advice is to pick up this book, Storyworthy by Matthew Dix. I'm going to be incorporating some of the material out of his book today. So we're going to go through 3 different topic areas today. First of all, we're going to talk about why you should tell stories. Number 2, we're going to talk about how to find stories. And then number 3, we're going to talk about tips for crafting stories. So it's if you have any questions, feel free to add them in the chat. Feel free to let me know. We're going to have some interactivity later on in the session. We're also going to get to view a few stories. So I'm looking forward to being able to share some tips with you today. So first of all, we're going to talk about why you should tell stories. There's 3 really good reasons why you should incorporate stories into your public speaking. First of all, stories make your speech more interesting. It's when I was a kid in high school and I was on the local speech team, I quickly figured out that if I could jam as much information into my speech as possible, this would impress adults, and it could get you it could get you a ways in terms of just being able to impress people. And they're saying, oh wow, they've crammed all this information into something, so they must really know something. They must be a good speaker. It was only through years of working in Toastmasters that I realized that, yeah, it's putting a lot of information into a speech is good, but if your audience isn't retaining it, then then they're really not going to be interested in the speech, and really a lot of the information is just going to go straight over their head. When you incorporate stories into your speech, it makes it much more interesting. A lot of people like watching stories because they're entertaining. And by entertaining, I don't mean funny, but funny is part of it. But it's when you're able to make a speech interesting, you're able to get emotion coming out of the audience. And so this is something that's really important, that it's kind of our duty as speakers to be entertaining in some way, that you want to be able to make sure that your audience is interested in what you're saying. And stories is a very good way of doing this. Stories have plot in them, so that it's something that your audience can follow along with. It's something that your audience can be interested in, what's going to happen to the characters in your story, what's going to happen in terms of stakes. And that's something we're going to talk about a little bit later. But you want to make sure that your audience is interested in what you're doing, and that way they're going to be able to retain more of the information that you have. A second reason why you should be using stories in your speeches is that stories help you connect with your audience. Probably one of the biggest buzzwords in public speaking nowadays is authenticity, is that you want to be able to show your true self when you are presenting to your audience. And this is something that I definitely agree with, is that if you are able to show your true self, that your audience is going to be much more likely to connect with you as both a speaker and as something that what your information is saying. It's when I was a kid, we had a whole bunch of these Chicken Soup for the Soul books that we would buy, and you would read some stories of other people, and that you could use some of these stories. And I know that it's very popular, that it's something I did, is something that my dad did in some of his presentations, that you would just take some stories out of these Chicken Soup for the Soul books. And while these are good, while they will make your audience interested for a little while, what you really want to be doing is that you want to be telling stories about yourself. It's the stories that are about yourself is a story that only you can tell. It's something that is going to make you different as a speaker. Anybody can go buy a $15 compilation of stories off of their local bookstore shelf and put it into a speech, but only you can tell the story of yourself and talk about some of the journeys that you have gone through in your life. This is something that audiences are going to be able to really be able to connect on you with. It's your authentic self that is going to be most effective in being able to get out your message to both your audience and be able to share the change that you want to see in the world. Third reason why you should incorporate stories into your speeches is stories make your speech unforgettable. There's a statistic that is often cited in the public speaking world by cognitive psychologist Jerome Bruner in his book, Actual Minds, Possible Worlds, that stories are about 22 more times more memorable than facts alone. And while this might be a little bit hyperbolic in terms of how much this number, in terms of how much more memorable stories actually are, we can think about that as true. that I've gone to many lectures over the years. I've gone to many contests, and a lot of these speeches are filled on with facts and are filled with just some anecdotes that are definitely filled with these speeches. But it's stories is what you're going to be able to remember. This storytelling show that I went to several years ago, I can still remember the story of the man who was cheating at chess. I don't remember any of the statistics that were cited in the stories during that presentation. I don't remember the names of any of these people, but I remember the stories that the stories that were told. It is stories that are going to be able to stick in the minds of people. And that's ultimately what you want. You want your story, you want your presentation, you want your message to be able to be sticking into the minds of people. And its stories are what is going to be able to do that. So to start off our presentation today, I'm going to give you an example of a story that I told in a storytelling show in Washington, D.C. And I want you to think about some of the things that I've talked about in terms of how stories can be interesting, how stories can help you connect more with your audience, and how stories can make your speech unforgettable. And then we'll talk a little bit about that after we watch the story. The fire truck was barreling down on me. I thought if I ignored it, it would go away, but I couldn't help myself. I looked back, and there it was, right behind me. So I just turned around, and I kept on running. For you see, I was at one of those small town festivals in the town next to the one that I grew up in central Minnesota, Dassel Red Rooster Days, home of the Midwest's largest chicken barbecue. But the chicken would have to wait because I was in the middle of the Dassel Red Rooster 5-mile fun run. Now I know what you're thinking, running isn't fun, and I certainly wasn't having fun that day. In fact, I was mad. I should have been mad that I was completely out of shape. I hadn't done near enough running that summer in order to train for this race. I should have been mad that I was completely overweight. Too many visits from the pizza delivery man had caused the scale to go way too far in the wrong direction. But I wasn't mad at either of those two things. I was mad at that fire truck. All of these races have a safety vehicle at the end of the race to control traffic and to make sure that all of the runners are safe. But because the fire truck was directly behind me, that meant that I was in last place. And I hated being in last place. I've always been a competitive person. I'm generally not very emotional, but the few times that I can remember crying when I was a kid were when I had lost. There was the elementary school track and field day where I didn't win any awards, and I had to be escorted out of the auditorium because I was crying too loud. There was the middle school basketball game where I was getting a ride home from my dad, and I was just bawling my eyes out in the car because our team had just lost its first game. I really hate losing, and I really hated being in last place. Now, there's a lot of things that go through your mind when you're in last place. Why am I even here? This is a waste of my time. Being in last place is being the ultimate loser. If I'm a loser in this, who says I'm not a loser in other parts of my life? Am I a loser in my job? Am I going to lose my job? Am I going to have to move in with my parents? I don't want to have to move in with my parents. Losers don't attract women. Am I ever going to get a girlfriend? Am I going to die penniless and alone? I would do anything to not be a loser. All of a sudden, the clouds opened up over Dassel, and a big sunbeam came down, and it shone onto a woman a couple blocks in front of me. But this wasn't just any woman. This was the woman in second to last place. It's almost as if the running gods were telling me, Tony, if you run a little bit faster, you can catch up with her. Tony, you will not be a loser today. And that is when I started sprinting. My arms flailed back and forth as I attempted to go faster. My feet dug into the hot pavement of the streets. Every step that I took a larger breath in order to try and get more oxygen to my aching muscles. Every step I took was more painful, but I had to run faster in order to catch up with her. I am running through the tree-lined streets of Dassel, the smell of chicken barbecue in the air, tens of people lining the streets cheering. But I cannot hear any of them because I am solely focused on the woman in second to last place. 4 blocks to go, I have cut the gap in half. 2 blocks to go, she is only 20 feet ahead of me. 1 block to go, only a single leap, and I will be able to catch her. With 10 feet before the finish line, I sprint by my unsuspecting foe, only catching through the corner of my eye the very confused look of a woman who does not know what just happened to her. I cross the finish line, and I am a winner. I am in second to last place. I am completely exhausted walking around the finish line. I still have a lot of time to kill before the chicken barbecue starts, so I decide to go over to the results poster. And I scroll all the way down to the second to the last line, and I see my name. Tony Dahlman, 58 minutes, 28 seconds, male, age 28. But all of a sudden, something catches my eye in the line underneath mine. Diane Anderson, 58 minutes, 30 seconds, female, age 62. 62 years old? I just sprinted 6 blocks to catch a 62-year-old woman? This woman is a decade older than me. I nearly had a stroke to catch a senior citizen. All of a sudden, my win did not seem much like a victory at all. I did some serious thinking about what winning and losing meant that day. And while I didn't realize it at the time, and while I am still way too competitive of a person, I learned a valuable lesson that day. Winning and losing isn't about who you beat. Winning and losing is about the changes you make in your life. And I made some major modifications in my life, and my diet, and in my physical activity. And in the end, I am a loser. I ended up losing my relationship with the pizza delivery man. I ended up losing several minutes off my race time, and I ended up losing over 100 pounds, and I'm now in the greatest shape of my life. In the end, I'm also a winner. I've won the opportunity to work really hard at my job. I've won companionship with my very supportive wife who puts up with me. But ultimately, I'm a winner because I am no longer getting chased by that damn fire truck.
Okay, so watching that story, so we can see how I told a story of my Dassel Red Rooster run, and it's the message that I was trying to get across was the change that I had seen in my life, the change that I'd seen in my life in terms of the modifications that I had made in terms of improving my diet, in terms of changing my physical activity, and how I lost a lot of weight in the middle of that decade. I could have told you about some of the things that I had done in terms of the diet that I went on, in terms of increasing my running, in terms of increasing working out. But that would have not been able to connect with you as much as an audience of telling the story of what ultimately pushed me to the edge in terms of being able to figure out how I needed to improve myself physically in my life, and how I decided that I did not want to be a loser anymore. So that's a way that you can think about how you can attempt to use a story to attempt to give a message in terms of how you want to present some things in your speeches. So we're going to move on to the second topic area of our speech, and that is figuring out how we can tell some more story, how we can figure out how to find some of the stories in our life. Now, this is something that I have always continued to struggle with, that you're trying to figure out that when you're watching people tell stories and that you're thinking like, well, I don't have interesting things that have happened in my life. What are the stories that I can tell about myself? And really, I think of myself as an extremely boring person. But we all have stories to tell, and that there's a lot of interesting things that are happening. And a lot of times things are happening to us every day that can be story worthy in terms of what are some of the stories that we can do in our life. So the first piece of advice that I want to give you is that actually come up with a type of list of things of some of the possible story ideas of something that of things that are happening in your life. And there's a few different tools. Actually, Toastmasters does have a story repository within its pathways system. And I'm not a huge fan in terms of how they have it set up, and that it's kind of a little clunky or unable to get in there. But if you like the pathway system and you want to have everything in there, I would definitely encourage you to try and find the story repository in there, and that it gives you some ideas in terms of that you can put down some different story ideas and that you can store it in the pathway system. I actually maintain a list in my Evernote system, which, if you're not familiar with, is a virtual notes taking system, and that I write down an entry every day in an attempt to figure out if there's any story ideas that happen in life. And I'll go back to the story worthy, what Matthew Dix is. Matthew Dix is a teacher by trade, and he has just an idea that he has come up with that he calls homework for life. And because he's a teacher, he's saying that he's giving you a homework assignment every day. And that's sometime during the day, you have to write down the most story-worthy idea of something that has happened to you during that day. And it's something that the first few days that it might be difficult in order to figure out exactly what story-worthy ideas have happened to you. But if you continue to do this day after day, you're going to be able to identify some more of the story ideas that you have in your life. Now, some of these ideas might eventually be something that can be put into your speeches, but some of those just might be some happy memories that you're going to want to be able to share with you for the rest of your life. So this is something that I would like to really encourage you to do, is that come up with some type of system, whether it's online. Matthew Dix uses a spreadsheet. You just have a Word document, just write down the most story-worthy idea. Talk about, and we're going to talk a little bit about more what gets into a story later on, but write down one idea every day. And if you have some ideas that pop up from your past, you can also include that on your list. And this is something that you can go over every month or so, and this is something that you can use so that when you're trying to come up with story ideas of things that you can put into your speeches, this is something you can incorporate. The other idea that I want to show you today in terms of coming up with story ideas is a tool called First, Last, Best, Worst. And this is something that Matthew Dix actually stole from somebody else, so I don't feel too bad stealing it from him. But if everybody could pull out a sheet of paper, and I will show you an example of it on the screen right now. So can I get a thumbs up from somebody if they can see a grid up on the screen with a Word document, first, last, best, worst? So what this concept is that they'll give you a prompt, and you have to figure out the first time that that has happened in your life, the last time that that has happened in your life, the best time that that has happened in your life, and the worst time that has happened in your life. So if everybody could just write something down on their sheet of paper. So on the left side, I want you to write down the prompts. The prompt is kiss, and then it's car, pet, trouble, injury, gift, and travel. And then across the top, you write first, last, best, worst. And I am going to give you about, we'll give you about 2 or 3 minutes, and then I want you to think about the things in your life. And I want you to figure out what was your first kiss, what was your last kiss, what was your best kiss, and what was your worst kiss, and try and attempt to fill in as many of these grid parts as possible. If anybody has any questions, feel free to write something in the chat, or you can unmute yourself if you have any questions about what's going on for this. Okay, I know that you might not be done with the grid yet, but you can definitely continue to work on this later today or later on in the week in terms of being able to develop some storytelling ideas. So I wanted to share with you when I filled out this grid, and I've thought about some of these issues before. So some of these are some story ideas of some things that I've worked on in the past, and some things that I'm going to continue to work on in the future. So I just want to talk a little bit about a few of them. So it's in terms of some things that I've been able to turn into story ideas. So it's my last kiss and my best kiss. She isn't in the house right now, so I can talk about Carla behind her back. But that is my wife, so it's just for the record. So, but it's the best kiss was actually my first kiss with Carla, and that's a story of a version of the first date that I went on with Carla when I kissed her for the first time after when I was dropping her off at her apartment in Sioux Falls, South Dakota on our first date. And that's a version of a story that I've told before. So that's definitely a story idea that I was able to come up with through this area. So when I was going through the pet line, it was, for the worst pet, it's like I was trying to think, it's like that I didn't necessarily have had a pet that was really bad, but it made me think about the story of when our dog Buddy died when I was a kid, when one of the field workers on our farm accidentally fed Buddy a chocolate bar. And I was extremely distraught about this. So I'm not exactly sure. This is the beginning of a story. There's some things in terms of being able to figure out how I'm going to be able to implement all of this, but it's definitely the start of a story idea, and it's maybe something that I can craft into something later. So when I was for the trouble, it was the best trouble was I was thinking about moving locker signs, and this is something that I thought about earlier in the week when I was preparing this document. Was that in high school that on your lockers is that people would put up signs if you were involved in certain activities, and me and some of my friends actually moved everybody's sign one down, and that there was about 7 people on that row of lockers that all couldn't find their locker because they had all found their locker based on where these signs were for other people. And people got really angry about that. So I really think that that's the best prank that I ever pulled off in high school. Again, I'm not sure exactly how I'm going to craft this into a story, but it's something that I can think about in terms of being able to craft some more stories in the future. And then for travel, it's for under worst travel, I put down China. And that was when my wife and I, for our honeymoon, we went to Beijing. And within the first day, we were scammed by some people in a mall that brought us to some tea house. And we ended up getting charged several $100s for a meal that we didn't realize until after it was all done. And this made me really mad at the time. And part of the problem with this is that you find out in the storytelling world that travel stories aren't necessarily as interesting as you think they are. So I need to be able to incorporate this story into another way. But again, these are just some ideas of some different stories that I can craft. So again, this is just a thought-provoking idea of some ways of some different stories that you can have, that when you think about all of the interesting things that have happened in your life. So this is a fun exercise that I would encourage you to do. I've done this with my Toastmasters Club before as a way of trying to get them to incorporate some more different stories in their life. So it's something that I would definitely hope that you consider in terms of being able to figure out some of the different stories that you have in your life. The third different topic area that we're going to talk about today is that some tips in terms of being able to craft your story. And so it's some things that I want you to think about in terms of when you're making your story and how you can make your stories better. Rule number 1 is that stories must have change in them. That is what is basically the defining characteristic of your story. In the running story that I told earlier, the change was that I changed myself from somebody who was out of shape to somebody who was in shape. So that is just the main arc of the story and how I was, and the change that you were able to see in my life. So if you cannot identify what about you changed as a part of the story, then it really isn't a story at all. It's just some anecdote. And while that still might be interesting, it's not going to be that memorable thing. It's not going to be that sticky thing of something that is going to be able to stay in your life. Rule number 2 is that it must be your story. It's that, as I told earlier, that it's like when you're telling stories about other people, it just isn't near as effective. So you want to make sure that you are the protagonist of your story. There's definitely going to be other characters involved, And there's definitely going to be other people who are helping you and might be able to that might actually be very instrumental in terms of what are the lessons that you're learning in terms of telling the story. But this should be your story. You don't want to be telling stories about everybody else. Now, something that you're thinking about is that there might be something that is happening to somebody else. But if you're telling the story from your perspective, and if you're telling about the change that you have seen in your life, that is still all right. That is still your story. And you're telling about what's going on in the world around you. But ultimately, it's you want to make sure that the story that you're telling is your own, and that's what's going to help your authentic self come out to your audience in terms of being able to share the message that you want to share. Rule number 3 is that all stories must have a 5-second moment. That there's a moment in the story where the change actually occurs. Now, in the running story that I told earlier, that moment was when I was reading the results poster and I realized that the woman that I had just sprinted down for 6 blocks was actually a 62-year-old woman. And it's so that you want to be able to identify the moment in your story. That you want to figure out what is the tipping point, what is the change that had taken place. And so I found this to be really helpful, that it's when you're listening to some stories and you figured out that really wasn't a story at all, that was just basically a big long biography. Why did I feel like that wasn't very interesting? It wasn't very interesting because the story wasn't about a moment. You want to make sure that your story is centered on one event, and that your story is centered on one point in that event that is ultimately a tipping point that is able to share some of the change that has taken place. Rule number 4 is that you want the beginning to be the opposite of the end. So when you're thinking about your story, it's really important to think about the end first, that you want to think about how were you changed as a person. So then when you're trying to decide how you're going to start the story, it's again, you want to be able to focus your story on an event in itself, that you are trying to figure out exactly what, that it's the more concise it is, the more focused it is on that moment, the better it is going to be for the audience. But if the beginning should be the opposite. So in the case of the running story that I told earlier, the end of the story was that I was in the best shape of my life and that I was a much healthier person. The beginning of my story was the opposite of that. I was completely out of shape. I was losing. I was not feeling good about myself. So that when you can have that contrast from the beginning to the end of your story, that's going to be the most effective. Is that if there is no change from the beginning of your story to the end of your story, then you're not seeing that change, and it's just not going to be as an effective part of your story. Rule number 5 is that all stories must have stakes. And by stakes, we mean that there has to be conflict, and there has to be something that causes your audience to care about what you are saying. In my running story that I told earlier, stakes is different from the change that you're seeing. Stakes is what is, but stakes is what is allowing your audience to be interested in the story. If I told you that I was going to tell you a story about how I lost weight, that's probably not going to be very interesting. No one wants to hear about your diet. I'll tell you that right now. But if I tell you a story about how I was in a race and I ran down a 60-year-old woman, that's the conflict. That how I was being chased down by a fire truck, that's the stakes. And that's something that I introduced very early on in my story. It was the conflict that was being shown, and that was something that allowed my audience to become interested in the story. So that's why I had these stakes in my story, and that's the conflict that allows you to become more interested in that. And that the final tip I'm going to give you is that something that I found to be very, very useful to me is that tell your stories in scenes. Always put your story in a place. That is going to allow your audience to create some imagery in their mind of what is going on. When I was telling the story of the race, I told you that I was on a road in central Minnesota and it was a hot day. Everybody can imagine that. So it's when you're telling the story and you're putting it in a place that allows your audience to get that in their mind's eye, to be able to be able to figure out some more of the, it allows them to think about what's going on and become more immersed in that story. Is that a lot of times when I'm seeing stories, some of the biggest problems that I've seen is that you're not putting your audience in a place, you're just telling them what's going on. If you actually put them in a scene, it's going to help you to be more effective in being able to tell those stories. So just go over those tips one more time. Stories must have change, must be your story. All stories must have a 5-second moment. The beginning is the opposite of the end. Stories must have stakes that allow your audience to be interested, and you want to tell your stories in scenes. So today we've talked about why you should tell stories in your speeches. We've come up with a couple different tools in terms of being able to help you come up with story ideas. And then I've also come up with some tips of helping you to be able to craft your stories. So I hope you've learned some storytelling tips. Again, I encourage you to check out Storyworthy by Matthew Dix as a way of improving your storytelling. And I hope that you're able to incorporate some storytelling into your upcoming speeches, and that it's going to allow your message to become more sticky and to get your stories out there, that you are the only ones who can be told. Thank you, and I'll turn it back over to Matthew.